Welcome to this webinar on interspecies justice, nature and sustainability with Anna Wienhues, Assistant Professor in Environmental Philosophy at the Institute of Philosophy at KU Leuven. This lecture, is part of a webinar series on power in sustainability transitions. And this lecture that we will hear today with Anna is not directly about power, but about aspects that we think are important to discuss when it comes to power and transitions. Because power is usually discussed in terms of humans, and therefore we are very happy to have with us Assistant Professor Anna Wienhues today, who can help us out with how we could perhaps think about non-humans in all of this and in transitions. Anna's talk will be about 45 minutes, and then you will be able to ask questions. We'll have some time for questions in the end. That was what I had to say before, I think. So by that, thank you for being here, Anna, and I leave over to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Asa, for the kind introduction. Let me quickly share my screen. Thank you very much for this kind invitation to speak today about interspecies justice. And indeed, I won't say much about power per se, but power and questions of justice are obviously strongly interrelated. And in respect to the environment, we are also talking then about a lot of different entities that can't speak for themselves. So to explain a little bit more my own background, so I'm an environmental philosopher. More particularly, that means that I'm specialized in moral and political philosophy. And I will explain a little bit more in a second what that means and how the approach you take in philosophy towards environmental ethics, what kind of approach we take, and what that means for how interspecies justice and sustainability is theorized in the field. But I should also note that obviously I'm presenting my particular view and try to provide a broader overview of the field as well. But one has to keep in mind that we are talking about a broad variety of different schools of thoughts and traditions, not just in the English speaking, but obviously in the international literature. So I can't represent all different kinds of voices and all kinds of ways of theorizing environmental philosophy. So today I would like to speak a little bit more about the tripart relationship between three concepts, which I think are quite important, but which all have their own contested debates attached to them, obviously in interdisciplinary literatures, but also very importantly within philosophy as well. So on the one side, different accounts of what constitutes nature conservation, how should we conduct it, why should we conduct it, what is nature, and so on. But that also relates to a more new field within, or a new debate within the literature on interspecies justice. Later, I will explain a little bit more what I mean by that, but broadly speaking, those are different non-anthropocentric theories of justice. That means theories that try to go beyond human interests and also consider the interests of non-human beings in different ways. And therefore, those theories are non-anthropocentric. You might have heard different types of terms like multispecies justice, ecological justice, animal justice. Those are all different notions within the same debate. I'm kind of treating them all as interchangeable here, despite that in fact they are not necessarily interchangeable because they are often based on different traditions, school of thoughts, and importantly imply often also quite different theories of justice that are distinct in many ways. But nevertheless, this is a new field of research that has sprung up within the last 20 years, where notions of justice have been brought into the field of environmental ethics, where until then political notions were less central than they are now. Now we see much more of an integration between political philosophy and environmental ethics. And obviously the third notion is sustainability, which again is a very much contested concept. And I would like to explain a little bit more in the next 40 minutes how the three are somewhat conceptually, but also morally interrelated. So for instance, we could ask where do we find nature and where do we find interspecies justice and sustainability, and what does that have to do with justice, for instance, when we think about nature conservation and sustainability together. So to provide a quick overview of what I want to talk today about is, first I will start a little bit on what is environmental philosophy, because I assume that that is not necessarily obvious for everybody in the audience today, and then explain what environmental values are, because they're quite important to understand the broader debates about interspecies justice, and then I will connect that to thinking about sustainability. So what is environmental philosophy? Most broadly speaking, one could think that environmental philosophy is the critical exchange of different arguments and reasons to theorize the human-nature relationship. And to make this a little bit more concrete and graspable, I'm using the specific example of species extinction as one typical concern in environmental ethics, as an example to explain the different angles we can take from different types of environmental philosophy to think about the question of species extinctions. For instance, we have the philosophy of biology. And so in that field, people ask, for instance, what is a species or what is an extinction, to get a better idea of the concepts, of the scientific concepts we are speaking about. We also have environmental aesthetics. So there you might ask a question like, is the loss of a species comparable to the loss of a great work of art? So do they both have a comparable aesthetic kind of value we can speak about? Further, we have environmental political philosophy, where we are asking, for instance, questions about the state or the responsibility of the state with respect to anthropogenic species extinctions. What does it mean for our institutions? How should they respond to it? And what is their responsibility to respond to these? Are typical political philosophy questions. Justice is again also quite a political concept that falls into this field. And furthermore, importantly, we have environmental ethics, what most people will associate with environmental philosophy. And there we have different subfields like meta, normative, and application-oriented ethics, where we either really investigate the underlying structure of values and what they are, to then to turn to normative theories about what we ought to do, to more application-oriented ethics, like concerning a very particular decision-making scenario. So for instance, what should we do in the case of the extinction of a particular species? So here we are within the realm of environmental philosophy, and we can ask, for instance, questions like, what is the moral value that is lost to species extinctions? And also, why or when are anthropocentric species extinctions wrong? Important is that those two questions are separate. So for instance, when we compare the moral badness versus the moral wrongness of an extinction, we can, for instance, think about the example of a smallpox virus that is now extinct due to human actions because we wanted the smallpox virus to go extinct. So there we might have a potential loss of value, the loss or the value embodied by the species. But it might not be morally wrong to have caused the extinction of the species. It might even be morally required to do so. Therefore, we have two different levels of analysis working here with respect to environmental ethics. So broadly speaking, then ethics is then about the philosophical reflection about morality, so the different values that we might hold, and provides different theories and arguments to support different positions, but also importantly, to provide critical reflection on social and legal norms. So based on this, we can see the beginnings of environmental ethics, which is a comparatively new field within the university context. So when we look at Western universities in the US, in Europe, but also in Australia, then we only see the beginnings of environmental ethics emerging in the 1970s. Where different philosophers started to engage with environmental problems such as pollution, but also species extinctions. So historically, we can situate this against the background of the second wave of the environmental movement that we see during that time, that was triggered or was supposed to have been triggered by Rachel Carson's famous publication of A Silent Spring, which showed the impact of DDT on biodiversity and the environment. And so philosophers started to engage with this as well. One of these was Richard Routley, who later renamed himself Richard Sylvan, and he claimed very early on that these problems necessitated a new meaning in environmental ethics, and that was kind of the start of the field. Importantly, why did he argue that we needed such a new environmental ethics? Routley's concern was that what he called human chauvinism, which we now better know as anthropocentrism, or more precisely, moral anthropocentrism. So the idea that only humans are morally considerable as ends in themselves, and non-human nature is only ethically relevant insofar as it serves human interests, because maybe it's beautiful or maybe because it's useful. And Routley thought that this was exemplified by traditional Western ethical systems that conceived of nature as something to be used by humans as they please. So, for instance, he used Immanuel Kant as a typical example of an anthropocentric view that we find in moral philosophy that he considered problematic. According to him, non-humans, and more specifically animals, so according to Kant that is, are mere things and therefore cannot be subjects of moral duties. Of course, modern Kantians have a quite different view, but this is the view that Routley criticized. So how did he try to show that anthropocentrism was not an appropriate view? There he engaged in which is now a famous thought experiment, which is the last person on Earth thought experiment, where imagine you're the last person left on Earth, and now this person goes around cutting down every single tree and killing any remaining species left on Earth. Routley thought that this attitude must surely be wrong, but based on a purely anthropocentric reasoning, according to Routley, this would be justified. So according to Routley, this showed that there is non-instrumental value in nature, that is value that is not dependent on nature's usefulness to humans. And so to understand this better, why we might have the same intuition as Routley or why we are not, we need to know more about moral values, what they are, in which one each of us and for which reasons we might personally care about them. So what are moral values? And as I mentioned earlier, these are quite important to then understand later on interspecies justice debates, as one first needs to get a sense of the underlying moral values driving the debate to understand how then later on justice can be theorized. Very broadly speaking, there are three different categories of moral values. Intrinsic values, instrumental values, and relational values. But here one needs to keep in mind that these are really just broader categories, and we find many different subcategories and distinctions within the debate regarding each individual type of value. So one needs to keep in mind that there's a broad plurality of interpretations what each value is, but also that they are ultimately contested and multi-layered. Those distinctions are, though, not really relevant for the moment, but one needs to keep in mind that there is not one uniform view about what moral values are and why they matter. To explain that in an environmental context, I quite like this table created by two former colleagues of mine, Anna de Plasesem and Molly Chapman, who I think put it quite nicely, with which they try to explain the difference between intrinsic, instrumental, and relational values. So intrinsic values on their account are based on an object's own properties. So for instance, they use this example of a tree. I value this tree in virtue of its own properties and for its own sake, importantly. Instrumental values in that respect are different. They're about the usefulness of an object. So I value this tree, for instance, because it provides me shade, which is useful. And then the third category would be relational values. So this idea that there's a particular relationship between me and some kind of object. There they use the example of a tree again, but that could also be species or particular landscape. And they say, well, I value this tree because it has a specific significance for me, for instance. Maybe this tree has been in my parents' garden and I have known it since my childhood and have a specific relationship to it. It's this particular tree I care about. And there it's important that we don't intrinsically value the tree. It's not about its own properties, it's about the relationship, but it's still not identical to instrumental values, because instrumental values are essentially about objects or entities we consider ultimately replaceable with other objects that provide the same function, whereas relational values refer to object or entities or beings that are non-replaceable to us. So this is the important distinction in the literature. So coming back to the example of extinction, to explain a little bit more concretely what this might mean. So we, for instance, might think that extinctions are morally wrong or morally problematic because they involve the loss of intrinsic values. For instance, we might think that the loss of a species is a living historical form, or because of the irreplaceable design that it embodies, it's morally lamentable and problematic because of the loss of this intrinsic value. But we might also think that species extinctions involve the loss of instrumental values. For instance, the ecological significance or economic use value of a species or biodiversity. For instance, the pollinator functions insects provide for agriculture is very important. In the third categories, relational values, we can think in terms of the cultural personal significance of a species that might be lost if it goes extinct. So these are different examples of how we can think about loss of moral value and how it matters for how we think about environmental protection. Obviously, this does not only apply to species. Also many different kinds of entities can be ascribed moral value of these types. So for instance, also individuals can have a moral value. They can be intrinsically valuable, for instance, as entities that matter in themselves. They can, as in the example earlier from de Plasesem and Chapman, they can also have intrinsic and instrumental and relational value to us. For instance, the bee that provides pollination services to us is not valuable only as a species, but also as individuals. And the same might apply to the specific trees within a landscape, and not just the landscape itself, that we might find relationally valuable. So this is important as a background to understand then broader views about the moral considerability of living beings, because here we are speaking about one specific subcategory of intrinsic values. So while there are different ways of thinking about intrinsic values, like for instance, we might think the Mona Lisa is intrinsically valuable, as the historical and aesthetic as artifact that it is, we usually don't think an artwork like the Mona Lisa is morally considerable as well. This is a specific type of moral value that applies to individuals, usually as entities that matter in themselves. And so to explain that better in the environmental context, and then when we look at environmental ethics, we then find different views, typical views on moral considerability of living beings. And so we find anthropocentrism, so the view that Rowley critically discussed as some view that he thought should be dismissed, based on thinking that only human interests and human beings themselves matter in themselves. But we have also a broad variety of other views, like sentientism, so the idea that all sentient beings are morally considerable in themselves. So everything that you know in terms of animal ethics falls into this category. We also have biocentric views that argue that all living beings are morally considerable. And we also find different kinds of ecocentric views that go even further, that would maybe argue that also species or ecosystems are morally considerable as entities in themselves. Obviously, again, with all of these different views, you have different nuances and different versions of them, but those are the broader categories. And sentientism, biocentrism, and ecocentrism in this context are the non-anthropocentric fall within non-anthropocentric views, which could then potentially ground different theories of justice later on. So this is usually called the inclusion question of moral status in environmental ethics, about which beings or things are morally relevant for their own sake, regardless of whether they are useful to me. And this is important in order to then build onto how we think about justice later on. So coming back to the example of extinction, we can think about extinctions in terms of the loss of moral value involved, but we can also then provide different arguments or reasons for avoiding this extinction, why it's morally problematic. And I think interspecies justice is such a way of making an argument for why we really are morally obliged to avoid extinctions as much as we can. If we understand interspecies justice as a theory of just nature conservation, so ultimately bringing the two elements that are from the three elements that I showed earlier together about nature conservation and interspecies justice. And in a moment, I will then also add the third element about sustainability into this picture. So to explain, basically interspecies justice then is the possibility of a non-anthropocentric interpretation of the concept of justice. And that can be understood complementary to typical intra-human theories of justice or social justice. So what do we owe to other humans? We then have a complementary theory about what we might owe to non-human beings. And both together are sometimes referred to as planetary justice. And so basically interspecies justice, on my view, should be understood as a non-anthropocentric version of global justice, ultimately. So we have global justice to other humans, and then we can also think about global justice to other species. And importantly, there's a variety of different terms, as I already said, multispecies justice, animal justice, ecological justice, and so on. Because they are coming out of different traditions and schools of thoughts, but also sometimes out of different disciplinary contexts where then different notions became more popular for a variety of reasons. So sometimes these notions are interchangeable and sometimes they're not. And here I'm merely more or less presenting my own view. So you shouldn't think that this is representable or representative of the entire literature, but just a small subject of it. So basically, the claim of interspecies justice then is that humans hold duties of distributive justice, on my view, towards non-human nature. So what does that mean? I think there, before I carry on, obviously moving to refer back to what I mentioned earlier about different types of environmental philosophy, the innovative aspect of interspecies justice is that we are now bringing different themes within environmental philosophy together. So theories of moral considerability in environmental ethics, what I've just been explaining earlier, and theories of justice that usually come out of political philosophy. So it's a political turn within environmental ethics that we can now observe, and this is where interspecies justice falls in. Okay, so against this background, we can now think about how the two are interrelated. So what would then be the justification for thinking that humans as moral agents hold duties of distributive justice towards non-human nature? We can surely think of a plurality of different arguments. I think that there are 4 different premises that together build such an argument. And I will explain each of them in turn in a moment. So firstly, non-human beings are morally considerable, and I already explained a second ago what morally considerable means in this context. Humans are also standing in a morally relevant relationship to them, so to non-human beings. And so justice is not identical to ethics, which is an important point to keep in mind. So claiming that we have duties of justice towards non-human nature is more specific than arguing that environmental ethics is a relevant discipline. And that is because duties of justice, on my view, are built on moral and specific morally relevant relationships, which I will explain in a moment, which differ to broader additional duties of environmental ethics that we might hold in the environmental sphere. Additionally, I think it's important for thinking about distributive justice that humans stand, to a degree at least. Sometimes there are a lot of win-win situations, but not always, in competition with other living beings for the environmental goods and resources, for instance, land as habitat or land as a resource that humans might want to use for other purposes that are always crucial for life on Earth, human and non-human life. And fourthly, we as humans do not morally own these environmental goods, so it's not that we have a historical moral property claim to them, and therefore we can maybe distribute environmental goods and resources as we like. That's not the case. And so we need to justify our appropriation. So the use of these environmental goods in terms of, for instance, land use must be morally justified. And so based on these different premises, we can then think about what is owed. And there we have different principles of distributive justice that come into place that explain what duties of justice might be in different circumstances. But let me first explain all of these different premises in more detail. So starting with the first one, non-human beings are morally considerable, which I already explained earlier, and that is particularly relevant in this context for me because I'm taking a biocentric perspective. I think justice is due to all non-human beings as individual entities, as they can flourish and have morally relevant needs that then become relevant for a theory of justice. So we can get an idea of what their interests and needs might be and take that account in justice theorizing, especially in terms of distributing, in terms of different needs, for instance, with respect to what they need for the habitat, for instance, to live a flourishing life. So in that respect, I kind of fall in the middle of the broad spectrum of different versions of interspecies justice that you might find. There are obviously also sentientist or ecocentric perspectives on offer. What I find is very important about this, theorizing interspecies justice as opposed to theorizing environmental ethics is that humans stand in a morally relevant relationship to non-human beings that falls within the circumstances of justice. So to explain what that means, I think a morally relevant justice relationship in this context is that life on Earth is interconnected and also coexistence with each other. So we are in different causal and relational chains that matter, that create a connection where justice can function as an appropriate guiding principle. So we can identify a global community of interspecies justice where all living beings in different ecological processes are interrelated and connected with each other. And importantly, this morally relevant relationship also needs to fall within the circumstances of justice. So the circumstances of justice are a specific idea that we can find in works already from David Hume and John Rawls about that basically provide an origin story of justice. So how does justice come about? Why do we need justice? And which are the conditions at the same time within which justice can provide answers? Because ultimately, as I said earlier, justice and ethics are not identical. So we need a story about when justice concerns arise and which concerns can justice actually appropriately answer. And so there are different circumstances of justice, I think, that are relevant in this context. Importantly, for instance, humans and non-human beings are vulnerable to each other's actions. And importantly, in terms of interspecies justice, non-human beings are very much vulnerable to human actions and choices with respect to the environment. So we can very much influence their well-being and ability to live a life. And importantly, when we think about distributive justice more specifically, there needs to be some form of limited scarcity concerning important goods. So as I said earlier, we have certain goods that need to be shared, so which all living beings in different ways need and require, such as, for instance, habitat in the case of non-human beings. And these goods need to be limited to a certain degree so that justice can provide a guidance for how to justly live and use and distribute these goods. In a world of in a theoretical world of plenty, we wouldn't really need a theory of justice to guide us if there would be enough for everyone and every being. If we would also have, in addition, obviously, different conditions in place where people would not take more than they need. So this is the second condition, which I think is important to apply in this context. To explain that a little better, to get an idea when those circumstances of justice and the relationship apply and when they don't, I think they clearly apply between different living beings on Earth, but they don't apply, for instance, with our relationship to extraterrestrial life forms. So we might think that once we meet other aliens in space, that we owe them certain kind of duties towards how to treat them rightly, but we don't necessarily owe them anything in terms of distributive justice because we are not causally interconnected in the same way as we are as different living beings, part of a global system which is geologically and climatically and ecologically interconnected. So based on this morally relevant relationship that falls into the circumstances of justice, it's important, this idea that there's also an element of competition where justice can then provide answers of how to deal with this in a just way. If there would not be such competition and we always would have win-win situations, again, justice would not necessarily be a concept we need. And so in this context, I would conceptualize this as a sharing relationship about how to justly share environmental resources with different life forms. And I think that then some version of ecological space would then be the currency of justice in this context. So a broad basket of different kinds of ecosystem benefits or environmental resources that most life forms depend on. And then fourthly, as I already said, so there is no idea that there is some kind of a prehistorical property right that humans can claim. So our appropriation and use of environmental resources must be morally justified. And that is provided by theories of justice, by providing different principles of distributive justice to basically regulate That's why there are normative theories that regulate in a morally relevant way what actions are just and which are not, and then show what would be a just interspecies relationship in these contexts. And so that depends, for instance, on my view on different circumstances of scarcity. So we might owe non-human beings different things depending on what circumstances we might find ourselves in, because these are relevant to take into account to understand what justice might demand in a specific context. So what would that mean in practice, though, without going into any detail about the principles themselves? Well, yeah, so interspecies justice clearly requires extensive habitat conservation in certain ways in order to fulfill the demands of justice in this context. And so returning, for instance, to the example of extinctions that I introduced earlier with respect to environmental philosophy more broadly, within this way of thinking about it, extinctions would be the outcome of interspecies injustices by, for instance, not providing non-human beings with adequate habitat. So, for instance, when extinctions are driven by land use change, by, for instance, using more and more land for agricultural purposes than it's necessary, then that could be understood as resulting from an unjust deprivation of habitat, conditional, though, on a few other conditions that need to be in place, but I won't go into those details right now. But just to have an idea of what interspecies justice might then demand. And so against this background, then we can combine interspecies justice with how we might think about sustainability. And so let me provide here a few examples of how this relationship might look and what might be a plausible way of thinking about it. To just have a short background, what I mean by sustainability, because obviously what is meant by the term sustainability differs significantly between different fields and areas of application. And we also have different kinds of terms, not just sustainability and ecological sustainability, but also sustainable society, sustainable development, and so on. And so what is useful in this context is to, for instance, compare different more applied fields like sustainable material cycles, where sustainability is about an efficient and effective reuse of materials in a circular economic process, with, for instance, green moral and political philosophy, where sustainability usually takes more the purpose of a moral ideal that society ought to achieve. But despite that sustainability is used in so different contexts, there's always a shared normative core, in my view, that it's desirable to sustain certain goods, opportunities, and processes on the long view. So ultimately, sustainability as its lowest level is a normatively charged idea how a certain type of stability is morally desirable. So against and beyond this core, sustainability obviously is very much of a contested concept. So there are many sustainabilities, many ideas of what sustainability might mean to different people. And as Marcel Wissenburg put it lately nicely, is sustainability is not about ecological facts, but also primarily about a normative choice for the society and the environment that we deem worth living in. So against this background, ethical reasoning can come in and contribute to the debate between different types of sustainabilities by reflecting on environmental values and theories of justice to help to justify and negotiate this normative choice about which type of sustainability we are speaking about. So to provide a little bit more context to this, I think there are two different ways, broadly speaking, in which environmental philosophers are currently contributing to the debate about developing non-anthropocentric justifications specifically for sustainability. And there are two different ways of going about it. On the one side, we can explain how interspecies justice relies on a particular interpretation of sustainability. So we can basically think how sustainability fits within the idea of interspecies justice. Or we can think about and consider developing different accounts of sustainability or an account of sustainable development. The two are not the same, but we find both being discussed in the literature, and show how these are built on different theories of interspecies justice. So here we are thinking about how interspecies justice fits within sustainability or sustainable development. So in the following, I will briefly explain what both of these kind of options would entail for the relationship between sustainability and interspecies justice. So regarding the first option, we can think about how interspecies justice relies on a particular sustainability interpretation there. So here we are, as I mentioned earlier, within the theory of interspecies justice and thinking about how we should theorize interspecies justice, taking into account the sustainability matters as well. So in my view, there are two different ways in which sustainability features in an appropriate account of interspecies justice. The first is with respect to the circumstances of scarcity that I mentioned earlier. So the different principles, so we have different principles of justice that apply to different circumstances. And so we have different levels of demandingness with respect to what justice might require. So justice might require much more in circumstances of less severe scarcity than in circumstances of more severe scarcity, where it's literally impossible to satisfy all morally relevant needs. And so if we find ourselves in circumstances of less than moderate scarcity, then we, on my view, have a duty to pursue ecological sustainability policies in different ways. Those can be economic policies and so on, to reach a world of less scarcity. So basically to reach a world which might ultimately be ecologically sustainable, because we are not currently living in ecologically sustainable circumstances. So this is against the background that typical assumptions and theories of justice is that we have moderate scarcity, and principles of justice are built on that. But when we think about sustainability transitions, we are precisely in need to theorize that we're currently not living in conditions of moderate scarcity. So we want to reach conditions of moderate scarcity. And in addition to that, transitions also need to be just, because we are also not living in a fully just society either. So we have more than moderate scarcity and unjust circumstances that we need to consider. In addition to this, we also have ecological sustainability, in my view, also shapes the circumstances of scarcity. So ultimately, because it limits the scope of what could maybe be justly distributed without causing further environmental degradation, there's a second element of how ecological sustainability, in my view, interacts and is included in how we should think about interspecies justice. But these are just two examples of how I think about it, and this is not exhaustive of every view in the literature. To provide a quick last example about how interspecies justice might be fit within sustainability or sustainable development theory, let me look at the particular notion of sustainable development and how that might relate to theories of interspecies justice. So the most well-known definition of sustainable development that everybody surely knows is the Brundtland Commission definition of meet the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. So different theorists have thought about how interspecies justice fits into this context. So I think it's useful to think about sustainable development then having three relevant features: sustainability, development, and then the addition of non-anthropocentrism. And so the addition of non-anthropocentrism creates then two important changes within our notion of sustainable development. Firstly, it influences in terms of what the permissibility of substitutions might be with respect to what counts as sustainable, and it influences how justice and then ultimately morally relevant needs are defined, which has an impact for how we think about development on the Brundtland definition. So to briefly explain what these two effects would be, starting with sustainability, so influencing what would be sustainable in terms of the permissibility of substitutions, falls into these broader debates between weak and strong sustainability that many will surely be familiar with. And so in this context, one typical question asked by economists would be a factual question about substitutions, right? Can we substitute natural objects with human-created artifacts while retaining the same level of human welfare? The relevant moral question about substitutions here then is that is added, are some substitutions also morally permissible? Many of them, if we take an interspecies justice view as given, won't be morally permissible. So we need some version of strong sustainability in order to account for the habitat rights, for instance, that I mentioned earlier. With respect to development, we see something similar, because here we need to broaden our idea about what sustainable development is by not just thinking about it in terms of current and future human, but also current and future non-human needs, which in turn again influences what should be sustained with respect to the earlier substitution question. So to summarize, with respect to the example of sustainable development, non-anthropocentric theorizing would influence it in, I think, at least three ways. Firstly, which type of substitutions are morally permissible. And this is also a reason why Alan Holland, for instance, thought that sustainability should be thought about a commitment in terms of a commitment to the natural world, instead of talking about the natural world as natural capital. The scope of sustainability would be increased by increasing very obviously the group of entities with morally relevant needs. So we have a different view on which environmental limits apply and why they matter. And thirdly, following through this is also that then the possibility of achieving sustainability in practice obviously would look different. For instance, depending on what kind of theory of interspecies justice you might find plausible, you will have different views on how sustainability can be achieved in different economic sectors when morally considerable entities as involved as resources. So for instance, animal ethicists are quite critical about ideas like sustainable fisheries, which they think can't be sustainable by definition. So these are three different kind of ways about how interspecies justice theorizing can impact on how we think about sustainability, and in this case, sustainable development. And so this goes importantly beyond an anthropocentric strong sustainability concept in many ways, and introduces non-anthropocentric sustainability theorizing. Okay, so this already leads me to the end. So I hope I could clarify a little bit how nature conservation and environmental ethics is related to interspecies justice, and how sustainability fits into this broader picture about how nowadays interspecies justice is theorized within this context, that now we have this political turn in environmental philosophy, where we think much more in terms of a political context like justice. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Anna, for presenting your perspectives and these valuable insights. I and several in the audience also work with sustainable consumption or beyond consumption, and I was just thinking, just wanted to ask you if you have any thoughts about how to approach these issues of interspecies justice when it comes to consumption. For example, in food consumption, it's not about it's not extinction of species. Well, it's also using species to. Yes, okay. You see what I mean? Do you have any thoughts or how we could start approaching that?
Yeah, that's a good question. So as I mentioned earlier, so I think there is this duty of sustainability to achieve interspecies justice, but ultimately that's also a duty we have already towards other human beings as well. So interspecies justice strengthens that duty. It doesn't create a new duty in that respect. And consumption, sustainable consumption, and in this context, usually decreasing the consumption if we are speaking about overconsumption in industrialized societies is obviously an important element of achieving some kind of sustainability in this context. I think there it's relevant to think about two different kind of the types or grounds of interspecies justice, because now I just talked about one in terms of nature conservation. And so if we think in terms of interspecies justice or nature conservation, obviously we have a duty to, for instance, reduce our land use footprint as much as we can in order to make it possible that we leave enough, or as much as possible is probably never enough, habitat for non-human species. So that will have then an impact obviously on the food system, because we need to think about how we consume less or better food resources in order to leave more habitat. But this is this particular dimension of interspecies justice, which is about theorizing the justice relationship to wild beings. But there's also a broad literature that I didn't mention about, which you primarily find in animal ethics, which tries to just theorize the justice relationship with farm animals, for instance. So there you will have obviously a different set of duties according to these theories that argue that we should reduce our consumption of specific foods, particularly animal-based foods in this context, either reducing them and ultimately usually with the aim of fully not using animals in agriculture, depending on the theory. Theories are slightly distinct in this respect. And there we have a second interspecies justice reason to reduce animal-based products based on those different grounds of justice, because there we have different justice relationships which create different duties. And those, in this respect, happen to coincide and require a similar type of actions.
Sorry, forgot my microphone. Thank you very much for that. We have one comment saying that thank you for the lecture, and another question is that a question is, can both species and individuals be moral objects? For example, in the case of fisheries and forestry.
Yeah. I think they're always morally relevant. I guess you can distinguish between different levels. I think, for instance, different moral values always apply. Even if you're an animal ethicist, for instance, and you think only individual animals are morally considerable, you probably still think that a species or landscape has some kind of other value. You might think it has relational value and instrumental value. So you always have like different types of levels coinciding in a place. But when you look specifically at moral considerability, so those entities that we might owe something as a matter of justice, which is a very specific kind of notion in broader ethics, then again, both can be the recipients of, can hold justice entitlements. So depending on the theory. So an animal ethicist, for instance, would say species are definitely not holders of any rights. They don't have any plausible interest. But we have ecocentric theories of justice that say no. Actually, an ecosystem, for instance, does have its own form of flourishing, and therefore we owe it justice as well. So yeah, so one needs to make a decision which theory one finds most plausible, but yes, it can be both. And obviously that makes cases like fisheries and forestry, for instance, quite complicated, especially forestry, if you think that more than sentient animals are morally considerable, which is the same case as agriculture, which right now I'm thinking about, because for biocentric, obviously, that is a really interesting case where you have to think about a lot of non-sentient beings that are morally considerable, but are necessary object of use. So there we have a relationship which is ultimately very instrumental and quite alien to how usually environmental ethicists think about these type of relationships.
Thank you. Another question I think we have time for. Thank you for a super interesting talk. I'm curious about if there's any space or scope to differentiate between different entities within this theory. or if species is some kind of absolute category. I know you take biocentric starting point, but is there scope to premiere sentient species over non-sentient, for example?
Yeah, very good question. So something, obviously I couldn't go into it because that's a lot of detail. I think what we owe to a specific entity is always based to the specific individual. And there I just use the notion of species as a kind of generalization for different kinds of needs and interest we can expect a specific entity to have, because because each of them tend to have a specific way of flourishing, specific needs that we can observe in different kinds of species, and therefore we can deduce from that the individuals that we say belong to that species probably have those needs and interests that we need to take into account. So in that sense, a broader theories of interspecies justice will really need to distinguish between all of those different interests, despite that they all have an entitlement of justice. What the content of that entitlement is really will differ based on what life forms they are. My specific biocentric view is something that I call like non-ranking biocentrism. So I don't think that there is some kind of hierarchy between sentient and non-sentient species. But I also don't think that we should treat them as morally or equally considerable. So I'm taking a view that comes out of ecofeminist work, which tries to show that actually different life forms and their moral value are incommensurable. And based on that incommensurability, we need to take them as they are. And I think that kind of opens the space for justice theorizing, because if we already know exactly what kind of hierarchy we are speaking about, I'm not sure whether we need justice to provide us any answers that hierarchy of value didn't tell us at the beginning in the first place already.
Great. Thank you. There are 2 minutes, and there are 2 questions that I think we will save for. We will have a discussion with the PhD students after this, so we'll save those questions for then. Instead, I'll take this question, and it reads, "Thank you for this. I was wondering what you think is the best way to implement what you describe here in public policy?"
Yeah, that is a this big $1 million question. I'm not sure whether if I would still work at the philosophy department, if I would know how to do this. So I mean, there have been these debates about, for instance, rights of nature and so on, and I think there is some plausibility to that, but I don't think I would be careful of not overstating how important right of nature debates are in this context, because ultimately they're a different way of nature legislation that we already have. But ultimately, yes, so we need to have more ambitious environmental protection legislation. And then based on that, how do we reach that? Well, yes, then we need to think about different kinds of democratic theories and democratic theorizing and democratic practice. And practice theory and sociology and all of these kind of questions about how to bring about change and what are the limits to change, because I think one needs to be careful to not think about that changing minds, so that convincing people that interspecies justice is a relevant concept is enough, because obviously the challenges are very pragmatic, specific, and structural, which go considerably beyond what values people might hold.
Thank you. And just in time, because now it's 10 o'clock, and I thank you very much, Anna, for coming, participating and presenting. Very valuable for us. And thank you for the audience for posting questions and being here. And this will be the last webinar on power and sustainability transitions. I think, you never know. So thank you everyone for today.